Dennis Rodman's record with NBA officials includes real technical fouls, a real ejection, and a real suspension. It does not include a league-wide memo written specifically to target him, an internal referee report describing the exact sensation of a headbutt, or a rule change requiring every arena in the league to adopt a new escort protocol because of one incident. Those specific claims do not appear in any contemporary NBA report from March 1996, and a documentary script has no business presenting them as settled fact.
Knew he would. Yes, he would. Jordan defending Strickland, cutting off the baseline.
The premise of a suspension arriving with no technical foul called at all is also inaccurate for this specific game. 2 technical fouls were assessed before the ejection, part of the official record rather than a detail this account can leave out. The real incident happened on March 16, 1996, during a game between the Chicago Bulls and the New Jersey Nets, at what was then called Continental Airlines Arena in East Rutherford, New Jersey.
Bench people for the Bulls. And Juwan Howard playing a big game at 10 points.
Rodman picked up a technical foul for slamming the ball down after a defensive play, then a second technical for a rebounding foul against Rick Mahorn, triggering an automatic ejection with roughly a minute and a half left in the first quarter. Referee Ted Bernhardt was standing near the top of the key when Rodman approached him following the ejection call, closing the distance quickly enough that Bulls teammates and Nets players nearby had little time to step between them, and contact between the two men's foreheads followed, described by multiple contemporary reports as a headbutt. What happened immediately afterward is well documented without needing embellishment.
So, went to the Bulls. Nobody has very long. Yes, you get.
Rodman pulled off his Bulls jersey and threw it onto the court, knocked over a cooler near the bench, and headed toward the locker room. He did not stay quiet about the incident afterward. Rodman told reporters, in comments picked up by the Associated Press, that the league should suspend him if the contact had genuinely been a deliberate headbutt, a public dare that became part of how the story was covered in the days that followed.
Of Chicago, the big man. That's what I used to call him in Detroit.
The NBA's response came within days rather than requiring an elaborate new legal framework invented for the occasion. The league suspended Rodman for 6 games without pay and fined him $20,000, a punishment tied to the physical contact with Bernhardt and reviewed through the league's standard disciplinary process, rather than a newly drafted conduct clause built specifically around his behavior. Rodman served the suspension during a stretch of Chicago's historic 1995-96 season, a year the Bulls finished 72-10 before winning the championship, with Rodman back in the lineup well before the playoffs began.
Sensational basketball. Little touch pass lays it right to Dennis Rodman,
Rodman's relationship with officials before and after this incident was genuinely combative, and that part of his reputation does not need inflating to be interesting. He led the league in technical fouls across multiple seasons and developed a well-known habit of getting in officials' faces after unfavorable calls, behavior the league addressed through its existing technical foul system for years without treating him as a special legal case requiring a rewritten rulebook.
Michael Jordan hasn't scored a...
The March 1996 incident stood out specifically because it crossed from verbal protest into physical contact with a referee, a genuinely rare event in the league's history, regardless of how confrontational a player's on-court personality might be. That reputation was already well established by the time Rodman arrived in Chicago for the 1995-96 season. He had spent years testing the patience of officiating crews first with the Detroit Pistons and then with the San Antonio Spurs, drawing technical fouls at a rate that made him one of the most closely watched players in the league whenever a whistle went against his team.
Guy that he is, that brought tears to his eyes. You got to be happy for the heart of the...
Officials working Bulls games that season were not walking into an unfamiliar situation. What made the Bernhardt incident different was not the tone of the argument, which fit a pattern referees had seen from him for years, but the physical contact that followed it, a line his prior confrontations with officials had never actually crossed.
Bad angle on the pass. Rodman can play the top side. Actually, Vin was open a couple times.
Rodman's trouble with officials was not confined to a single incident, even within his own Chicago tenure. In January 1997, he was suspended 11 games and fined $25,000 by the league after kicking a cameraman positioned along the baseline while chasing a loose ball during a game against the Minnesota Timberwolves, a far longer suspension than the one tied to the Bernhardt headbutt a year earlier. Taken together, the 2 suspensions in consecutive seasons show a pattern the league was actively trying to manage rather than a single isolated flashpoint. The Bernhardt incident also arrived during a season when Rodman's off-court behavior was already generating national coverage for reasons that had nothing to do with officiating.
What an enormous block, and Rodman comes away with a big smile on his face.
He published the autobiography Bad as I Want to Be later that same year, a book that leaned into the same reputation for unpredictability the headbutt had reinforced, and he had already built a well-documented habit of changing his hair color for high-profile games and public appearances, another detail reporters covering the Bulls that season referenced constantly when describing him.
And Scotty are willing to accept Dennis Rodman as for who he is and what he can bring.
None of that context excuses physical contact with a referee. It does explain why a 6-game suspension for a player already under that level of scrutiny became one of the most heavily covered disciplinary stories of the Bulls' championship season. No available source supports the idea that the NBA distributed a targeted memo to officiating crews before this specific game, that a formal internal report characterized the headbutt in the language of illegal filing, or that arenas league-wide adopted a mandatory ejected player escort policy as a direct, documented consequence of this incident. Those additions would make for a more dramatic script. A separate suspension that same year is sometimes folded into this same story, and the two should stay apart. Later in 1996, Rodman drew a 2-game suspension from the Bulls organization itself, rather than the league office, after a profanity-filled live television interview following a loss to the Toronto Raptors. That incident involved no referee and no physical contact, and it carried a different team-issued punishment rather than the league-imposed 6 games and $20,000 fine tied to the Bernhardt headbutt. Treating the two as the same event erases the distinction between a team disciplining its own player and a league disciplining a player for contact with one of its officials. Rodman's role on that 1995-96 roster is part of why the 6-game absence drew as much attention as it did. He led the league in rebounding that season, his 5th consecutive rebounding title, a statistical dominance at a single category that had few parallels in league history at the time. Chicago's coaching staff, led by Phil Jackson, had built the team's interior defense and second-chance offense substantially around his ability to control the boards alongside a front court that otherwise leaned on Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen for scoring rather than rebounding.
Excuse me? Well, that set wasn't too bad.
Missing 6 games during the regular season carried less competitive risk for a team that finished 72-10 with room to spare. But it still meant the league's most productive rebounder was unavailable for a meaningful stretch of a historically dominant year, a cost the front office absorbed without public complaint about the length of the punishment itself. The specific footage from that night, Rodman removing his jersey, the cooler tipping over, security moving him toward the tunnel, has circulated for decades as one of the signature images of his career, replayed in retrospectives about the Bulls' dynasty and about Rodman individually far more often than the underlying technical fouls that preceded it. That imbalance in what gets remembered, the dramatic aftermath over the 2 relatively ordinary technical fouls that triggered the ejection, is itself part of why the title's premise, a suspension with no technical called, took hold as a plausible-sounding claim even though the actual box score from that game contradicts it directly. He remained one of the league's most dominant rebounders for the rest of the decade, led the NBA in rebounding for 7 consecutive seasons overall, and won 3 more championships with Chicago after this incident, in 1996, 1997, and 1998. The headbutt against Bernhardt is remembered today as one of the more notorious moments of his career, precisely because it was unusual even by his own standards, a moment where his well-established friction with officials crossed a line the league could not address with a technical foul alone. It remains, decades later, one of the small number of documented cases of an NBA player making physical contact with a referee's head during a live game, which is exactly why it still gets cited whenever the subject of player conduct toward officials comes up without needing any invented policy change to explain why the moment